Thank you, and don't forget to buy them when you check them out. I'm going to introduce our three distinguished authors in the order in which they're going to speak. They'll each speak briefly, and then we'll try to have as much time as possible for you to interact with the authors. So I know there are lots of questions that they will raise, and certainly having read each of these books, they raise lots and lots of questions and even answer some, which is even better. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Chaz has had an extremely distinguished career as an American diplomat. He is now blessedly out of that role and is able to say really what he thinks, although I rather think when he was a diplomat he did as well. I know him best as in his Middle East role as having served as ambassador in Saudi Arabia, particularly during the crucial period of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and he writes in the book quite impressively about that period, which not too many people have done. But he was also stationed in many other places. He famously was in China at the time Richard Nixon went, and I believe was his translator with Mao Zedong. Chaz is fluent in more languages than I know exist. So he will be our first speaker. Our second speaker, whose book is entitled Gaza Mom, and is a Gaza mom, and has her Gaza mom with her, so we welcome you as well, that's a big job, as anybody who has been a parent knows, but she is also a well-known writer. To those who get their news from the blogosphere, she is one of the people who has helped us understand the Palestinian issue, particularly with a focus on Gaza. She has also written for the Guardian newspaper and has been a reporter for Al Jazeera. And her book, I can tell you, is it's both lots of fun to read and it's also poignant and occasionally sad. It also has a few recipes in it. So it has a bit of everything. You can tell from its title, Palestine, Politics, Parenting, and Everything in Between. Our third speaker in the third book, third speaker is Joshua Foust, author of Afghanistan Journal. Again, a blogger who is well known to those who have been following events in Afghanistan. The title of the book tells you the name of the site where he appears most frequently, registan.net. He has been a military analyst specializing in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the post-Soviet Central Asian region. He is currently a senior fellow at the American Security Project in Washington, D.C. So we'll start with you, Chaz, and I forgot to tell you the name of his book. It's America's Misadventures in the Middle East, of which there are actually quite a few.
More than there should be. As Bill mentioned, I spent 30 years in service to the United States as a diplomat, and during that period was very careful to avoid the Middle East, but finally it caught up with me, and I arrived in Saudi Arabia at an exciting time. In many ways, this book, America's Misadventures in the Middle East, the title pretty much explains the content. It's about how we got to the sorry pass in which we now find ourselves. This is a voyage of discovery, a series of essays and speeches which provide a real-time look at what was happening and what I thought was going wrong, and unfortunately, more often than not, I proved to be all too prescient. So the book starts, as Bill mentioned, with my experience in the Gulf War, where I was very, very determined, if I had anything to do with it, to ensure that General William Tecumseh Sherman's definition of the purpose of war was applied. He said the purpose of war is to produce a more perfect peace. I failed completely. There was no war termination strategy, and a military triumph of enormous, perhaps unprecedented proportions was never translated into the political arrangements that might have produced a victory. The war, in fact, because there was no war termination strategy, never ended. Saddam Hussein remained in power, and some years later, a decade or more later, in 2003, we walked into the great ambush called Iraq, from which we are only now extricating ourselves. Also, in this book, there's a lot of discussion of the so-called peace process. This is now a historical reminiscence of something that no longer exists, although people like to pretend that it does, because it's so politically convenient. But I think in the region itself now, this peace process, which extended for most of the 44 years or so of the occupation of Palestine by Israel, that is the occupied territories beyond the 67 borders, this is now seen as a transparent fraud from beginning to end, the purpose being not to produce peace, but to keep everybody distracted while Israel seized more land and settled more colonists. So it took me a while to come to the conclusion that there was less there than meets the eye. But again, in America's Misadventures in the Middle East, you can read how I came to the conclusion everybody else, much smarter than I, had long before come to. I think I have to say that the book is also about, as I mentioned, our stumble into Iraq, which was, of course, preceded by our lurch into Afghanistan. We had very feasible, simple, and achievable objectives in Afghanistan, namely to bring the perpetrators, or at least the sponsors and architects of 9/11 to justice, kill them, capture them, eliminate them, and to punish those who had given them shelter and safe haven, namely the Taliban regime. Basically, in my view, we accomplished these things by around the time of Tora Bora, as best we could by military means. But for reasons which are very hard to understand, our mission morphed into something quite amorphous. It's very hard for anyone. I know Josh is going to explain what victory in Afghanistan would mean, even though, in my view, we've already lost that war. The point is that we hung around, but we also went into Iraq, a country which we have ruined, which is now divided violently between two religious tendencies in Islam, whose Christians have almost all fled, despite the historic role they played in that country. We have driven 20% of Iraqis from their homes, 10% remain in exile abroad, half of those driven from their homes. And as we leave, we do not know whether Iraq will enjoy any degree of domestic tranquility, and we do not know what its strategic orientation will be. Will it be a stooge of Iran, or will it somehow return to its historic role as a balancer of Iran? You could say, in a way, that our major achievement in Iraq, aside from eliminating Saddam Hussein, at huge expense, obviously, to the Iraqi people and to ourselves, our main achievement was to make it necessary for us to substitute ourselves for Iraq as the balancer of Iran in the Gulf. And given the poor standing we now have in the Gulf, especially as the Arab awakening sweeps through the common space of networked youth in the Arab world, each revolution in each country having its own characteristics, sort of like a pan full of popcorn. You know, each kernel pops at its own time and takes its own shape, but somehow they're all related. This has left us, this and the total collapse of the peace process have left our country with remarkably little influence in the region, which I find depressing because I spent my years as a diplomat trying to exercise influence on behalf of the United States. I'll stop here, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions about events in Bahrain or Libya or whatever, or maybe even Saudi Arabia, which I know better than those.